this time, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker, Shannon.
Thanks, Kim. Welcome, everybody. If it works for you, I'll tell you a little bit about myself, and then we'll kind of launch into the topic of the day, which is collaboration, and specifically around engaging your members and your partners in the work that you do. So just a little bit about myself. Again, my name is Shannon Studden, and I am a program specialist here working primarily with the network development team. I came to the center this past spring from the continuing education department at the University of Minnesota Duluth. And my job there was to create leadership development and continuous improvement programs outside the university. So I worked with a lot of different organizations in Minnesota and in Wisconsin, and worked in a wide variety of industries, including healthcare. Before that, I spent a lot of years managing the leadership development and talent management programs for Cleveland Cliffs, which is a global iron mining company with several sites here in northern Minnesota. And I also served as a faculty member in the School of Business and Economics at the University of Minnesota Duluth. My educational background is in the field of industrial and organizational psychology. So that field, if you're not familiar with it, takes concepts from the field of psychology like group dynamics, interpersonal relationships, systems theory, and it applies it to the workplace. So in that field, a particular interest of mine is the topic of influence without authority. So how people are able to get other people on board with their ideas when they don't have formal authority that gives them the power to direct other people's activities. We all know people who are really influential, and we know people who aren't. And I've spent a lot of time researching, talking to informal and formal leaders, and facilitating some really interesting discussions about what makes people successful in an informal leadership role. And really, this is what you're tasked with as people who lead the charge for behavioral health integration. This is one of the many reasons I'm excited to be part of the team here that supports the work that you do, because to me this is a really interesting topic and a really challenging thing to do. So as I was preparing to speak with you today, I looked through a lot of the documents that you've all put together about your projects and your project goals and your plans for reaching those goals. And here are a couple things. I just pulled out a couple things that were represented in some of the different cohorts, including this current one. There were things mentioned like improving utilization of community resources and reducing readmissions to the ED and to urgent care, working with police departments, working with mobile mental health response teams, a lot of care coordination, of course, working with nurses. So when you look at this list, it's pretty apparent that a critical part of your job is to gain buy-in from partners and from community members. There's really nothing on this list that any of you would be doing all by yourself. That's sort of the nature of the word integration, right? So success in what you're doing requires collaboration in a lot of different forms. And in order to collaborate, you need co-collaborators who are engaged and involved in what you're doing. So let's look a little bit at what we'll do today, what our objectives are. Even I'm a learning and development person, and my eyes tend to glaze over when I look at learning objectives. So I like to kind of flip them around and look at objectives in terms of questions that we'll answer. So here are some of the questions that we'll address today. What promotes engagement and what gets in the way? How can I figure out what's important to my stakeholders? And what can I do to tap into what's important to them? What can I do before and during meetings to encourage engagement in the moment? Meetings can be a really interesting place where a lot of interesting things happen. And so we'll end today by looking a little bit at some specific strategies that you can use during meetings. So we'll start with kind of a broad view and we'll narrow it down as we go. We'll touch on a lot of topics. And just like with any webinar, some of these topics will be more relevant for you than others. Some suggestions may not work in your specific situation, but some might. And so as we go, I just ask you to kind of pay attention to what resonates most with you and think about your nugget from the session or your biggest takeaway. So let's start by agreeing on a couple of definitions, since all of these terms can mean slightly different things to different people. When we talk about collaboration, we're talking about working together to achieve a common goal. For our discussion today, we're going to consider stakeholders to be anybody who's actively participating in the work at hand. So this could be your board, this could be groups of employees, groups of providers, community partners, anybody else who contributes to the work involved in the integration of behavioral health and the providing of whole person care. Well, so when we talk about people who are engaged, we mean people who are committed to these goals and are willing to engage in activities that help achieve these goals. Because engagement is the focus of the webinar today, let's dig just a little bit deeper for a minute into what it looks like. It's one of those things that where we sort of know it when we see it, but it's kind of hard to put our finger on defining it. But as I'm sure you all know, it's really important to clearly operationalize what engagement looks like or what anything that we're trying to do looks like, so that we know what to look for when we're making judgment calls about how engaged your stakeholders are or are not. There's a global management consulting firm called Aon Hewitt, and they have a really great operational definition of engagement that consists of three pieces: the stay piece, the say piece, the stay piece, and the strive piece. So when people are engaged, they say things, they speak positively about the project, they advocate for it out in the community. They also stay, so they come to meetings, they continue to participate in meetings after that initial meeting, where sometimes after that attendance drops off, but they don't drop off, they continue to come. And last, they strive, so they put forth effort. They speak up in meetings, they propose ideas, they volunteer to do things, they follow through on what they say they're going to do. That's going to be just for the purpose of today's conversation. This is our operational definition of engagement. So these are things that we can see people doing and hear people saying. So I'm going to pull up, keep that definition in mind. I'm going to pull up our first poll question here. So using our stay, and strive definition, what proportion of your stakeholders would you say is fully engaged in the work of your project? Just take a couple minutes and answer that question. All right, so it looks like we're sort of centered in the middle. We've got 2 on the lower end of the middle, so 21 to 40%, and 1 in each of the categories above it. So I feel for you. That's a really difficult situation to be in. And hopefully today we can give you a couple of tools to bump that percentage up a little bit for you. The more engaged stakeholders you've got, the more likelihood of success of your project, which I'm sure you all know. So we'll give you some strategies that may be able to help you with that. We've got one person who's in the 61 to 80. So I just encourage you to keep reaching out to each other, and as you work through these challenges, learn from each other and find out what's worked for other people that are working on a lot of the same things that you are. Thanks for your responses, and hopefully we'll bump those up the next time I speak to you. We'll see improved numbers. All right, so let's talk a little bit about your role as somebody leading this charge. So what's your role as somebody working to increase engagement? So because you're responsible for leading a community culture change, I probably don't have to tell you that you've got a tough job. It's your role to pull together a pretty diverse group of people with different priorities and sometimes even competing priorities. They've got different perspectives, they've got different personalities, they've got egos, we all have egos, and your job is to try to get them all working toward a common goal. It's hard enough to do this when you're in a formal leadership role, so when you can directly supervise the group and you've got formal power to assign responsibilities and to hold people accountable. But it's exceptionally difficult when you're an informal leader, where you need to be really good at influencing people without having that formal authority. And that's why not everybody does what you do, because it's really hard. So as I said, we're going to go over some strategies today for influencing people outside of a formal leadership relationship. But before we move on, I just want to point out that an important point, and that's that we're not talking about strategies for manipulating or controlling other people. Manipulation obviously breaks down trust, which will only ensure that you get zero engagement. And you've all probably lived long enough to know that you can't control other people. So, but what you can do, and this is something that can really only be done by you as someone leading this process, is to set up the environment in a way that makes it more likely that people will feel and do what you're hoping they'll feel and do. So that's what we're going to give you some tips on today. Let's talk a little bit about the research and what we know about collaboration and engagement in groups. Effective collaboration, as you've probably learned by trial and error, is pretty impossible without having engaged group members. We know that when dealing with complex problems, as you all are, these are very complex problems that you're working to solve. Groups do a better job making decisions and solving problems than individuals do. So all those different perspectives, all those different mindsets, the different areas of expertise, and all the other benefits that come from putting multiple heads together. We know from decades of research that the more engaged your stakeholders are, so the more they stay and strive, the higher the likelihood of success of your project. Meaning you'll meet or exceed your goals, you'll tend to make fewer missteps along the way, and you'll build stronger relationships. So we know we want engagement. The question is, how do we set up the environment to increase the likelihood that we'll get it? At the, there's a slide at the end of this slide deck that shows a set of resources that we think could be really helpful to those of you who want to more fully understand engagement or have specific engagement-related goals. And one of those resources is a book called Committed Teams by Mario Musa. And in that book, he outlines very clearly what it takes to really get commitment from team members. And the things that we're going to look at on the next few slides come from that book and from the decades of research that has been done into effective teams. So there's two factors that really have to be in place in order for any individual to be engaged in a group. One is for all group members to have a common understanding of the vision, so that big why. What are we working toward as a group? If there's a lack of clarity about what the group is trying to do, or there are different interpretations of what the group is trying to do, it's almost impossible for everyone in the group to direct their efforts in the same direction. It's a little bit like you're just shooting in the dark. Nobody quite knows what you're aiming for. It's also critical for every member of the group to understand exactly why he or she is there individually. What's their purpose? Why are they in the room? What expertise or perspective do they bring that nobody else can? And this is something that, as leaders, we often have clearly outlined in our head why we've invited a certain person. We tend to think that we're better at articulating that to the individual person than we really are. And so really making clear that each person knows exactly why they've been invited to be part of the group and how they fit into the bigger picture. Very often when we're really immersed in something, we think other people know as much as we do about it and feel the same way we do about it, and we tend to think that we've communicated something a lot more than we actually have. So if you've got stakeholders who aren't as engaged as much as you'd like them to be, this might be a good thing to revisit. Do they really understand the vision? And do they know specifically why they've been asked to participate in working toward that vision? So, whether they buy into that vision is another question. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But really making sure that they clearly have a grasp of both of these two things is critical. It's a perfect place to start. So revisiting the vision can be as simple as having just a group conversation with your stakeholders. You can ask things like, throw these questions out to the group and ask things like, how does the vision describe what we want to become? Do we feel that our goals and activities are aligned with our vision? What unique contribution does each of us make to the achievement of our goals? And remember what your role is as a leader. What your role is in these conversations is to draw information out of your stakeholders you can clearly understand where they're coming from. So that means that you probably would be doing a lot less talking than anyone else in the room. The responses you hear from the group will give you a pretty good sense of how much consensus there is. And they'll give you and the other stakeholders the opportunity to answer questions and provide clarity and make sure that everybody does have a common understanding of the goals of the group and feels that their role in making it happen is very clearly defined. This can really serve as a foundation for a really valuable discussion across all the group members. So it's critical for stakeholders to have a really clear shared understanding of what the group is working toward and what they're there to contribute. So these two factors have to be in place, but by themselves they don't guarantee engagement. There's more to it than that, as you've probably guessed. So in order to be truly engaged in any group, people need to feel that their values and the group values are in line, and that other group members value their contribution. So if you think back to when you were in school and you had to do a group project, a dreaded group project, when they were bad, those were really bad. And you can probably trace those bad ones back to at least one of these two factors. So if you valued quality in your end product and you had other group members who didn't value quality as much as you did, you probably felt a lot less engaged in the group. If your suggestions were often ignored, you probably felt less valued by the group, and as a result, you probably put in less effort. That whole stay and strive idea again. And you could probably make the same assumption, draw the same line in any work group that you're part of. You've experienced the lack of engagement in yourself. We all have. To get at these additional factors of aligning the values of the individual stakeholder with the values of the group, you can continue on with your conversation with your stakeholders with questions like these. So really helping people connect those two things through questions like, what about the vision resonates with you? What aspects of the vision of our project are meaningful or exciting to you individually? What aspects of our goals are meaningful or exciting to you? How do our vision and goals overlap with your own goals? Sometimes people haven't really made this connection in their head, and being asked the question and explicitly being asked to think about it can help make that connection. So let's look at a couple tools for making this connection right now. Oh, but first I want to do a poll question. Sorry. we seem to have lost an item on our, so we're going to go, instead of a scale of 1 to 5, we're going to go 1 to 4. We're going to say 4 is completely true. 1 is not at all true. 2 and 3 are in the middle. So to what extent is this statement true for you? The statement is, I feel confident in my ability to influence my most disengaged stakeholder to be more engaged. All right, so we're continuing our pattern of being in the middle of the bell curve. So we've got some 2s and some 3s, 1 more 2 than 3. So we've got some varying levels of confidence. None of you are a 1, so that's good. And you've obviously had some success doing this, just based on where you are right now. So that's good. But we don't have anybody who's feeling completely confident. So hopefully we'll give you some tools to increase your confidence a little bit. These are some really good, concrete, simple tools that you can use to come up with some strategies for addressing your least engaged stakeholders. Thanks for your responses on that. Let me close this, get this out of the way. All right, so let's give you some tools to up those confidence ratings. So let's talk a little bit about stakeholder analysis. So I'm going to show you 2 stakeholder analysis tools that I've used in situations that are very similar to your initiative, where one person or a small group of people is trying to get buy-in and some action from people that they have limited or no formal authority over. The purpose of these tools is to help you clarify that connection that we just talked about. So the connection between what's important to each of your stakeholders and the goals of the project. Then it does 2 things. It helps your own thought processes, and it also helps you as you plan your work and your communication with your stakeholders. Stakeholder analysis does require, I will warn you, some time and energy, but it can really pay off in the long run. If you're feeling like all of your stakeholders really already get this connection, they really understand that why they're participating, but you're not getting the engagement you like, again, I would just caution you to check your assumptions. So again, when we're immersed in something every day, we think things are really clear to us. We very often assume that others have the same level of understanding. So keep in mind that this project might be something you think about and you work on every day, but it's only one piece in the lives of your stakeholders, and they may need some more help connecting the dots than you do. One tool that's very commonly used in stakeholder analysis is the stakeholder map. And the purpose of a stakeholder map is to help you put together a complete picture of your entire population of stakeholders. It takes into account each individual, and this is for individuals, not for groups. So it takes into account each individual's potential influence on the project, the impact of the project on them, and their current attitude about the work being done around, in this case, around integrating behavioral health. It's important to point out up front that this particular tool, this map, is a tool really for you to work through on your own or with one or two trusted allies. It's really probably not something you're going to want to share with your whole stakeholder group, because it can be a little bit emotionally laden. But it can help you to identify priorities and strategies for addressing stakeholder engagement. And you'll see what I'm talking about emotional aspect in a minute. So the process works like this. You identify each of your stakeholders, and if you've got a really big group, then just prioritize. Take those people who you are either most concerned about or have the biggest impact on your project. You can do this in pieces. So identify each of your stakeholders and determine whether they have a low, medium, or high influence on the project. So that vertical axis over there on the left. And whether the project will have a low, medium, or high impact on them. So that horizontal axis. And then you plot each stakeholder on the map using a shape that corresponds with your estimate of their attitude toward the work being done. Are they an enthusiast? You can see the shapes over on the right. Are they an enthusiast, an opponent, or are they somewhere in between? And you classify them as neutral. And this isn't, a highly scientific process that you need data to support. This is just based on your experience with them. And the purpose is not to, again, come up with a scientific study, but just to help you really prioritize, know where to direct your energy first, and help you come up with some strategies. So let's look at an example. So here's an example of what a completed stakeholder map could look like. This is a really small group of stakeholders. just to keep things simple here. You can see that Joe in the yellow box on the top left has a strong influence over the project. He's not terribly strongly impacted by the work. He's in the low box on the horizontal axis. And he's been classified as fairly neutral. So we've given him a square. Kim, in the top right, is high on both dimensions. She's got a lot of influence on the project, and the project will have a lot of influence on her. And she's also seen as an enthusiast, so we gave her a triangle. And Eve isn't too far off from Kim, but you see her as not being on board at all with the goals of the project. Going through an exercise like this can be pretty eye-opening because it can help you identify your top priority stakeholder. And when I say top priority, I'm not talking about being more valuable than other people, but when you've got a limited number of hours in the day, sometimes you've got to be kind of strategic about where you spend your time and your energy. So you may have guessed that the right corner shakes out to be your highest priority. These are the people who have a great deal of influence on the project and will be greatly impacted by the project. So these are the ones that you need to devote the most energy to. In this example, if I were heading up this work and I wanted to put some effort into increasing the engagement of my stakeholders, I'd zero in on Eve, our red circle near the top, as someone I wanted to devote some energy to in the near future. I'd also want to be sure actually that I don't lose sight of Kim because she can be my biggest ally. I might also do a little bit of strategizing around Dan's engagement because he's part of the top right quadrant as well. Again, this doesn't mean the other folks aren't important. It's just a way for us to be a little bit strategic about where we spend the finite amount of time and energy we have. If it feels a little bit overwhelming to look at a map like this and think, really, do I really have to spend time analyzing all these people in detail and putting a lot of effort into figuring out who I need to spend time on and how I should be communicating with them? I can give you a couple things to think about. The first is that, yes, sometimes it takes what feels like a lot of effort to sort through all of this. But I'll tell you from extensive experience and the research supports it, that the effort is worth it because there's all kinds of research showing that thinking through this and planning on the front end, or at least as early as possible, will save you an absolutely exponential amount of time on the back end, trying to fix and clean up when you're really having trouble keeping folks engaged. And the other is even better news, and that's that you don't have to do this all yourself. So you're part of a collaborative group, and if you put together a stakeholder map, this can also help you identify other people who are part of your group, and they can be your allies, and they can help you influence their fellow stakeholders. So that's the good news, and then or the bad news, and then two pieces of good news for you. So let's look at the kind of the next step in this process. So once you've used the map to pinpoint the stakeholders you want to think about some more, here are some questions for you to ask yourself. And here as opposed to the map, this is a valuable conversation to have in a group. You can pull in a couple other people into the conversation so you can get more than one perspective. And if you really want to go all in, you could even have this conversation with the stakeholder, him or herself. So this isn't something sinister that we're doing here. It's very sincere work with the end goal of ensuring that the relationship between the stakeholder and the broader community initiative is a mutually beneficial one. So you decide what makes the most sense of your situation, but regardless of what you decide, here are the questions to think about. So what's important to this person? What does the group need from them? How will the work of our project help with what's important to them? So again, making that really explicit connection between the work that the group is doing and what's important to him or her personally or professionally, or both. How can I or others more clearly communicate the connection between the project and what's important to them? And then something that we sometimes tend to forget, this falls off of our radar, but are there things that we can do to modify what we're doing to help more fully connect the work that we're doing with what's important to them? And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. And how will I know I'm making progress? So again, if we've got this definition of engagement being the say, stay, and strive, we've got specific things that we're looking for. What will I see to make me know I'm having a difference? So if we've made these changes, how will I know that we've got more engagement? If you've had conversations related to all the stuff that we talked about earlier with each individual stakeholder, whether individually or as a group, it'll be a lot easier to answer these questions, even if you aren't having this particular conversation with a stakeholder, because you will have heard a lot of the answers to these questions in the conversations that you've had with your group of stakeholders. All right, so let's look at an example. So this is, again, just like the stakeholder map, a fairly simplistic example, just for illustration's sake. But let's imagine that Eve from our map, so our red circle on our stakeholder map, is the chief of police in the community. She hasn't been coming to meetings lately. She has sent a representative to meetings, which is nice, but the representative doesn't have any decision-making authority. So whenever a decision needs to be made, we can't make it in our meetings because the representative has to go back to Eve and get her input and then bring it back to the group. So if you go through these questions, we really want to get Eve more engaged in the work of the group. This could be, here's an example of what things that you might find. Well, we've missed something. So what's important to Eve? Let's say that Eve, as the chief of police, is concerned with safety of her workforce and labor costs. What do we need from her? We need training commitment. So let's say that we're hoping to get all of our officers trained in mental health first aid, and what we really need is for Eve to commit to releasing officers for the amount of time it takes to put them through mental health first aid training. Oh, there we go. Safety and labor costs. So the work of the project will help what's important to Eve. We're hoping that if the officers are more familiar with the issues surrounding mental health in the community, that there will be fewer arrests. They'll be more able to deal with certain situations as they come up. How can we more clearly communicate that connection to Eve? Because if she's not engaged, it's possible that we really haven't explicitly made that connection clear for her. So it's maybe there's a comparison program. Maybe a similar program has been implemented in another community, and we can show her the results of that. When officers were put through this training program, there was increased officer safety, and there were lower labor costs that resulted. Again, I realize this is a simplistic example, but just for illustrative purposes. And then to think about, are there ways that we can modify what we're doing? Could we possibly work with our mental health first aid trainers to adjust the schedule in ways that would minimize overtime? Again, because we know labor cost is important to Eve. Are there ways that we can change the schedule to reduce her costs? And then how we know we're making progress? All we want is for Eve to come to more meetings instead of sending her representative. So if she's coming to more meetings, we'll know that we're making progress with Eve. The answers to the questions 4 and 5 really serve as the basis for my plan going forward. So if I want to think about, okay, coming out of this, thinking through this stakeholder analysis, now what do I want to do? My next communication with Eve might include sharing the results that another community achieved, or whatever my strategy is for more clearly communicating that connection. And letting her know that because I know labor costs are a priority for her, I'm just wondering what she thinks about scheduling the training around those busy times in the police department calendar. At times of the day that would be easiest for the department. So again, I realize that solutions are rarely this clear-cut and easy to implement, but you might be surprised at some of the aha moments that come out of a stakeholder analysis, especially if you have more than one other person helping you strategize. And really especially if you have the stakeholder, him or herself, engaged in the conversation as well. One quick thought I just want to share with you, which is related to the concept of setting up the environment so that people are more likely to do and feel what you're hoping they'll do and feel. Working with people can be frustrating, and I know that I'm sometimes guilty of attributing somebody's unwillingness to get on board with my ideas as them being difficult. But as Chip and Dan Heath say, who are two brothers who wrote a really great book about how hard it is to change ourselves or get other people to do things differently, what looks like a people problem is often a situation problem. Very often when you can make adjustments to a situation, whether that happens by introducing new information or changing processes or goals to be more in line with the other person's priorities or making other adjustments, the other person's behavior can change. This doesn't mean that there aren't difficult people out there, just that if you go into a situation with a mindset focused on setting up the environment in ways that will maximize engagement and in ways that are meaningful to your stakeholders, you'll make more progress and actually you'll keep yourself more engaged than if you start from a more defeatist place, kind of thinking that the other person's just difficult and there's not a lot you can do. So you can treat it like an interesting challenge. That's one way to keep yourself more engaged in the process, because when you're leading a really complex project, it's easy for yourself to become disengaged at points because there are roadblocks and there are absolutely frustrations, especially when you've got other people with different priorities involved. All right, I'm going to pull up another poll question. Let's talk a little bit about meetings. So I'd like to hear your experiences in meetings. So during a typical meeting related to your project, how would you describe the level of participant engagement in discussions and activities? Well, you guys are consistent, if nothing else. So here we are again. We're in the middle of the curve. This time, though, the good news is we've got more people feeling that most participants are fully engaged. So that's good. We've got one person is saying some are fully engaged. 3 of you are saying most participants are engaged. So obviously you're doing a lot of things right in meetings. I'm gonna give you a couple of tips and show you a couple of samples. Again, some of this is going to be more relevant for you than other pieces. But again, if you can just take one nugget, I think meetings are a place that I certainly can always do a little bit differently and shake things up and see if it changes anything. And again, you've got a lot of experience, so I encourage you to continue to stay in contact with each other and reach out if you're looking for some advice on a specifically challenging meeting or stakeholder. Close this out, get it out of the way. All right, so let's talk a little bit about things that we can do in meetings to maximize engagement. You obviously already know a lot about this. So we've looked at factors that promote and get in the way of engagement. We've talked about some strategies for connecting your approaches to the things that are important to your stakeholders. Now let's get down to kind of where the rubber meets the road. So the vehicle for making a lot of the things that we've been talking about actually happen, and that's in meetings. We've all been part of meetings that were really effective, and those that were, we can just say the opposite of that. So again, because meetings involve people, and you never have control over what people say or do, your job is to set up the environment to make it as likely as possible that people will feel engaged in discussions. What we know about encouraging engagement in meetings isn't very different from what we know about encouraging engagement in outside meetings and broader group activities. People are more engaged when they know the goals of the meeting and they know their contribution is valued. But because meetings are a really specific activity, we can get really specific about strategies for setting up the environment for meetings in ways that facilitate engagement. So we'll look at this in order. We'll look at first at things you can do before, and then things you can do during, and then things you can do after a meeting to maximize the odds of engagement. So according to Roger Schwartz, who is an organizational psychologist specializing in influence and groups and leadership, and he's a frequent contributor to the Harvard Business Review, he says one of the most common obstacles to engagement in meetings is the lack of a clear agenda, which may seem like a no-brainer, but I will tell you that A lot of groups don't use an agenda at all, not necessarily groups in your cohort, but just generally speaking. A lot of groups don't use an agenda at all. Or if they do, there are always ways that we can make our agenda be a little bit more effective. So a good agenda includes a list of the topics to be discussed, the decisions to be made,